The whole story behind the cleanup and redevelopment of Thea Foss it's pretty profound. It wasn't just contaminated, it was dangerous.
Well, in the 70s and 80s, the Thea Foss Waterway was an afterthought. It was an industrial dump.
The Thea Foss Waterway had the lowest water quality of any body of water in the state of Washington.
So we knew things didn't grow there, healthy things, that you would eat.
We knew it was polluted and it had to be cleaned up.
People openly talked about a struggling community, a dilapidated community, a contaminated community, a community that was riddled with crime. It was absolutely necessary to take control and see it through to its end.
The city knew that they needed to redevelop the Foss Waterway, and they couldn't redevelop until they addressed the contamination.
I think the story of Tacoma is one of resilience.
The Thea Foss Waterway is the story of vision and initiative.
It's not just a story about a waterway or a physical location. This is a story about a transformation of a city.
So I think it is a redemption story.
It was a leap of faith.
Many people don't understand that Tacoma was really the startup of the Pacific Northwest, and it didn't shift until some years later that Seattle actually outgrew Tacoma.
More wood was milled here than anybody else in the United States. And we had the chemical companies, we had Kaiser Aluminum, we had the smelter, and we were the second largest manufacturer of furniture west of Grand Rapids, Michigan.
The nickname originally was the City of Destiny. It was the terminus for the Northern Pacific Railroad. It was on a steep population glide path that was exceeding Seattle's, and then it shifted. The deepwater port of Seattle was that much closer to Alaska than Tacoma was. So it became more of an industrial town at that point, more of a city that was known for manufacturing and building and producing, and as a result, a dirtier town.
Cities are like people, born out of hope and filled with potential. They start small, but they grow and learn with the help of the people around them. They have aspirations and dreams, successes and failures. They have awkward phases and growth spurts, but are always evolving. Tacoma, Washington, like many other cities in the U.S., started small, but grew quickly with many early successes. During its heyday, it was a bustling city with a strong industrial base, a popular downtown, and a growing economy. It was the best of times for this small city nestled in the palm of Commencement Bay, but a price would eventually need to be paid for these boom times, a price no one expected to pay.
Well, I grew up in the 1950s. My folks had a jewelry store in the middle of the downtown, and the other stores were neighbors, they were friends. This was a place you shopped. The streets were crowded during holiday season. Our store was open till 9 o'clock, 6 days a week. There really wasn't an alternative to shopping downtown.
Downtown was a Coke at Woolworths or a chocolate soda. We'd shop for clothes, we'd shop for shoes. Leeds Shoes was the place to go because you could get a purse, matching shoes, little footies if you needed them, all for about $5. So between Cress, Woolworths, The Bon, Rhodes, and People's, the three big department stores, you didn't need to go anyplace else. You could find anything you needed. From lunch to Goldfish to a pair of shoes.
let's see, I was born in 57, and the mall opened up about 1965.
And all of a sudden, the Bon Marché moves out there, Penny's moves out there. Sears tried to hold on downtown for the longest time.
The new mall was the thing, and when you were a teenager, and I was at about the time, that was the hangout place. That's where you went to get really great dresses and to watch boys.
In fact, there were high schools that had their proms in that space out in front of what was the Bon.
It used to be a vibrant downtown, and that all changed, and everything went to the mall.
The downtown is sort of, as I wrote in one of my pieces, a huge sucking chest wound, because the retail had all left for the mall. There wasn't a place to park. People with automobiles didn't find it convenient.
With the result, the downtown emptied out and it became dark and dangerous and deserted.
So downtown Tacoma in the 70s and 80s, and particularly the 80s, there was really no good reason to be down there. There was still some offices, but people would come in, they would park, they would get out as soon as they could at 5 o'clock. There was one time that they actually had security guards because people who worked in these buildings didn't even want to walk unaccompanied to the parking ramps.
Glory days of the railroad were over. The route of I-5 had been punched through in the mid-1950s, and it's often been said you couldn't pick an uglier pathway through the city of Tacoma, and it suddenly rushed all the traffic right past the downtown. Crime rate is through the ceiling. It just was a very, very dark time.
At that time, the Thea Foss Waterway was an afterthought. It wasn't called the Thea Foss Waterway, it was called City Waterway. It was an industrial site. It was an industrial dump for the businesses and the industry that lined it on both sides.
The waterfront was contaminated, and at the head of the waterway, it looked like a fizzy 7-Up, and as the bubbles came up to the surface, they would burst and you would see an oil sheen.
The best way I can describe the Foss Waterway as it existed is it was probably the largest septic tank I'd ever seen, and it really was the armpit of Tacoma.
The Thea Foss Waterway, then called City Waterway, had the lowest water quality of any body of water in the state of Washington. At that point in time, Washington graded their waterways from AA to A to B to C. The Thea Foss Waterway was a C. As an academic, C says to me, passing. The Thea Foss Waterway was failing in terms of its water quality.
There were places around Commencement Bay and in the waterways where barnacles, for instance, wouldn't grow on boat hulls. And people would sometimes actually move their boats to certain areas, and it would help to actually kill the barnacles on their hull, or in some cases it would kill the algae that would grow on boat hulls.
By the 1960s, the bill was coming due for years of industrial and economic expansion in cities across the U.S. The damage done to the environment was becoming impossible to ignore, and in 1969, a spark from train tracks caused the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio to catch fire, and it wasn't the first time. This event helped raise national awareness of the effects of pollution, and in 1970, President Richard Nixon led the federal government to create an agency to deal specifically with this problem, known as the Environmental Protection Agency. In the decade that followed, additional environmental disasters came to light, including Love Canal in Niagara Falls, New York, and the Valley of Drums near Louisville, Kentucky. In response, in 1980, Congress passed the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, otherwise known as CERCLA, to establish a federal Superfund program that would be administered by the EPA to investigate and clean up sites contaminated with hazardous substances.
In November of 1983, the first NPL list came out with the top 10 Superfund sites in the country, and Tacoma was on that list.
Yeah, Superfund is the federal regulation that's about cleanup of toxic waste sites. The Commencement Bay Nearshore Tide Flats Superfund site which really is all of Commencement Bay, and the nearshore areas around Commencement Bay is also what they call a mega site. An operable unit is a discrete area, kind of a sub-area within the Superfund site. So the Thea Foss Waterway is one of 7 operable units within the Commencement Bay Nearshore Tide Flats Superfund site.
Puyallup Indians lived here for thousands of years. Yet 100 years after rail came into Tacoma, we were declared a Superfund site. We managed to destroy this pristine environment in a little bit less than 100 years.
I don't think it was a real big surprise to anybody. There was a local and state awareness of the fact that, there were problems in Commencement Bay, and I don't know that anybody totally expected it would be originally designated as a Superfund site, but I don't think that it was a real big shock that occurred.
This was no secret in Tacoma that there was industrial pollution. And there are people probably to this day that were okay with that. There was this sort of joke about smell those jobs if someone would complain about the pulp mill there that makes it smell like pulp, and that it was worth it. Tacoma had a reputation outside of Pierce County as being industrial, polluted, and so it already had this reputation. Being designated a Superfund site was not going to add to that stigma once you got out of town.
But there was a significant number of people who felt that it was an affront to them to have this body of water that's our heart and soul be listed and talked about in the way it was. It was a reality check. Puget Sound was dying. Puget Sound was heavily contaminated. It was bottom fish, and studies were indicating that they posed a health risk to people to consume them, and it was an open, obvious problem inside the community.
The city of Tacoma had recognized that they had a potential asset with the waterfront, but with its designation as a Superfund site, there was a lot of unknowns about, well, how is this going to affect what we want to do, because private investment pretty much goes away when you have the specter of something like a Superfund site or massive cleanups that are going to be necessary.
The city knew that they needed to redevelop the Foss Waterway, and they couldn't redevelop until they addressed the contamination.
Superfund outlines how one goes about doing a cleanup. And the first thing is to determine the extent of the contamination. That's the remedial investigation. You also determine who likely caused the contamination.
And so you're doing all this field investigation to figure out what is the level of contamination, what types of contamination, what is the extent of contamination. Is the contamination moving? Is it dangerous? So you're trying to identify and quantify the actual problem.
From that, you move to a feasibility study where you try and figure out what to do about the contamination, what needs to be cleaned up, what would happen if you did nothing, and what the range of the cleanup steps might be.
So what are the options that are available? What are the technology available? What are the best practices to help remediate? What are the feasible remediations for the site? How can we protect the environment, protect the people, and do it in a cost-effective way so that it's viable?
From there, the best potential cleanup option is chosen, and then from there, one can go about actually doing a cleanup.
Remediation is the actual cleaning up of the contaminants or containing them so that they no longer create a public health hazard.
So it's a multi-step process to actually clean up a contaminated site.
Taking those first steps in what would be a long journey, the Environmental Protection Agency and Washington Department of Ecology began the process of identifying the contamination in the waterway and along the uplands. In 1983, the same year the Thea Foss Waterway was designated part of a Superfund site, the city celebrated the opening of the Tacoma Dome, a sports and entertainment venue designed to draw people back to downtown. Where the Superfund designation was a big step back, the Dome was a much-needed step forward. So while the work continued on how best to deal with the environmental disaster on their doorstep, the city pursued other avenues to draw people back to the city center.
In the 70s and 80s, cities across the country were trying to figure out a way to revitalize their cores. And most of them had this problem of dealing with malls. And Tacoma was right there with most cities to do that.
You know, for those of us who wanted to make progress in the city, real progress, then we had lots of things that we were trying to do to clean the place up. And there were many panaceas in this city as far as trying to do progress, like building freeways or building skyscrapers. If we build this freeway, or if we only build this skyscraper, we'll be prosperous.
Major projects that I recall was the Tacoma Dome and what was called the Spur, the freeway entrance into downtown. Those were efforts to reconnect downtown to I-5.
The problem that was occurring, this was in the late 70s, early 80s, and into the mid 80s, was that downtown streets were still very congested with traffic. And so 705 was designed as a way to get traffic off of I-5 into downtown quickly, deposit it where it needed to go, and therefore relieve a lot of the congestion and ergo the pollution that was occurring on Pacific Avenue.
Tacoma needed a big effort for revitalization. And as the congressman, you know, I was expected to be able to help. Brock Adams had become Secretary of Transportation, and I called and I said, I need 1.5 miles of interstate authority. The guy laughs on the phone and says, Norm, there's 48,000 miles of interstate, and it's all been committed to various projects. So about 3 months went by, and the same guy calls me and says, you know, you're very lucky. 3 jurisdictions have turned back fractions of a mile, and they add up to 1.6 miles. You've got your Tacoma Spur. And the reason the Spur was so important, Tacoma was the largest city in the nation without a link to the interstate. You know, when the UW finally came to Tacoma, they told me that if we had not had the Tacoma Spur, they wouldn't have put the branch campus downtown. So that was a big deal.
With some controversy, the Tacoma Spur was completed in 1988, while work continued on the Waterway to identify contaminants and where they came from. The process was meticulous and time-consuming. Scientists examined the Thea Foss as if examining the scene of a crime, looking for clues in the water and sediments that could explain the cause of what nearly killed this small body of water. The results came in 1989, a pivotal year for the Waterway and the city at large.
Between 82 and 89, the EPA did further characterization of the contamination in Commencement Bay, and they decided what contaminants were of concern, what had to be done to clean them up so that they were protective of human health and the environment. They issued then their record of decision, and the record of decision set the basic requirements for what the cleanup had to entail, what chemicals, where, and to what levels they needed to be cleaned up to be protective. In 89 then started the process of the EPA negotiating with all of the responsible parties for the contamination about how the cleanup would happen and who would be responsible for that cleanup.
So through the process of the remedial investigation, there was another process going on where a Department of Ecology was working with the Health Department to identify sources of contamination to the waterway. And it was through their work that they identified the city storm drains as being potentially sources of contamination to the waterway. So based on that, the city was identified as a potentially responsible party, or a PRP.
Rainfall is probably the biggest factor affecting storm drains, that it picks up basically everything that lands on the streets. When you water your yard, some of that's probably going to drain off into the storm drain, and it might carry animal waste, it might carry fertilizer, pesticides, and so all those things actually end up in Commencement Bay as well. And I know people over the years would do things like drain their used oil in their car because they assumed, well, it's going to get treated. Nope, it ends up in the bay.
A lot of the land of South Tacoma drains towards the Thea Foss Waterway. I think it's about a third of the city of Tacoma, and it's the south end of Tacoma where the industries are. That stormwater all comes to those great big, two huge 96-inch diameter pipes that form the head of the waterway and really are the only freshwater flow into the waterway. But those two big pipes drain a lot of Tacoma and all of the industrial area of Tacoma.
When Parker Paint released white paint and the white paint came out, the Twin 96s, you pretty much knew the white paint probably had come from a paint company upstream. When Pickles came out, the Twin 96s, you pretty much knew the pickles were coming from Nally's Pickles. So the bottom line was, if we had white paint and pickles coming out the Twin 96s, we probably had a lot of other bad stuff coming out of them as well.
So that's where the whole issue of source control comes into play, and why one of the big programs that the city of Tacoma has undertaken is to make sure that all of the folks that are discharging industrial stormwater into the storm sewers and also all the municipal stormwater is clean so that it will not be recontaminating the sediments. And they had to do that before they could do the cleanup, which is another reason why the timeline takes the time it does.
As soon as the city storm drains were identified as a probable source of contaminants to the waterway, the city was right out there and doing a lot of work in mapping our system and testing our system to try and determine what the concerns were. The city's sanitary and storm drain systems had previously been connected, and so there were still some remaining cross connections out there, so getting the sanitary connections, the waste systems out of the storm systems was one of the first things that we needed to do.
In the 60s, the city separated the storm from the sanitary as best they could, but there were still areas where maybe they were connected. So the simplest way to determine those locations was in the late 80s, we went out and we popped manholes on the storm system and dipped a bucket in there and tested those samples for fecal coliform. And by doing that at different manholes throughout the system and comparing the elevated results, we could determine where the cross connects were, and that was an important way to make sure that any potential sanitary source to the waterway was eliminated. Tacoma needed a way to sample its storm drains because of the potential impact that had on the Foss Waterway. To determine the storm drain contribution to the sediments in the waterway, we put bottles in the storm drains themselves and let the sediment from the storm drains accumulate in those so we could sample them.
Like dogged detectives, city crews went from drain to drain, tracing chemicals down through the drainage system, up to the streets, and eventually to the originating source of contamination, all in service of a forgotten body of water that in 1989 was renamed the Thea Foss Waterway to honor the woman who pioneered boat building in Tacoma. While efforts continued to breathe life into this old town, that same year, Tacoma would hit a new low.
If you look back at Tacoma's history, if there was a low point, there was a shootout on the hilltop.
Former Army Ranger, I think he was, had enough of people on the hilltop that were involved in gangs, and the two sides, pulled out their firearms and exchanged fire right on a residential street. 60 Minutes and, the national news picked it up and portrayed it as something out of a Clint Eastwood movie.
And I think that was really the tipping point. That's when people in Tacoma decided enough is enough. We need to take control of our destiny again. That was the point. I believe it was 1989. That was the low tide.
In 1989, the city was hit with several hard blows. They discovered their own drainage system was contributing to the contamination of the waterway. Violence was erupting on the streets, and the cleanup was stalled by legal and bureaucratic hurdles. But instead of giving up, the city fought back. Entering the ring was a new city manager who was about to propose an unconventional idea that would combine the city's efforts to clean up the waterway with their interest in revitalizing its shores.
Ray Corpus.
Ray Corpus.
Ray Corpus.
Ray Corpus was the city manager of Tacoma for actually a long time, and I think he was really the key person instrumental in cleaning up the Foss Waterway.
He understood the importance of the waterway and the environment, not only for Tacoma's lifeline from an economic standpoint, but also as a cultural standpoint, about the importance to the Puyallup tribe, the importance to the history of wildlife and fishing in the region.
And if there was ever someone born to represent a city or a community, it was in his DNA. And he just had that sense of making the place better and doing everything he could to improve the quality of life with the city.
My name is Ray Corpus, and I was the city manager of the city of Tacoma from 1990 to the middle of 2003. When I became city manager, it gave me an opportunity to provide more focus on the environmental challenges facing the city. And it also allowed me to particularly focus on Thea Foss, which was an asset that could be just a great site for the city. Every great city had some city waterfront feature, either with a river, a lake, an ocean, and I thought that Tacoma could take advantage of that.
Ray Corpus was the city manager that really led the effort to acquire the properties down here on the Foss and to redevelop this piece of waterfront as part of the central business district.
And so it was a simple premise. If we leave it up to the private sector to come in and all of a sudden develop these parcels, they're never going to do it because they will be encumbered by the cost of the cleanup, making the development not profitable for whoever is going to come in. So the strategy was to get the areas cleaned up and have the city buy them and take on the responsibility to clean it up and the waterway at the same time.
And then they hope that the Foss Waterway Authority can come along and sell off parcels that are now clean and certified individually, and that the path to renovating that shoreline was going to be shorter if you do it that way than another way.
There was quite a bit of talk about it, and it kind of fell into two different camps at that time. There were folks that said, this is too much of a risk. We can't commit the city to invest in all this. It's going to cost us too much money. And then there were other people in the city that says, no, we have to do this. If we don't do it, nobody else is going to.
It was a controversial decision because people didn't see that long-term vision. It was old industrial wasteland that how can you envision what it is today as you see behind me?
I think it was 1990 that the city did the deal with Burlington Northern to purchase the primary waterfront properties that were previously in the ownership of the railroad.
And so, we ended up paying $6.5 million to the railroad. Ray, of course, negotiated it. I would have paid 3 times that as much for the land. I would pay whatever to get a hold of that land because it was something that was a once-in-a-century opportunity for the city to do.
The reason I was nervous was because the city was taking on this major responsibility for the cleanup. I was glad they did it, but I was worried, can they do this?
The idea for buying of the property actually came on one of my visits to Baltimore. There was a tower there. I was able to look out over the harbor, and about that moment I realized that all the work that Baltimore had done, taken 30, 40 years to develop, that improvement could be applied to Tacoma, that we could do something similar with our Thea Foss, with our waterway. What needed to happen with Tacoma from its notoriety as a dirty city into one of a clean city had to be a bold step, a transformative step. People understood if you did nothing, if you just waited for 20, 30, 40 years before the cleanup, you would have lost hundreds of millions of dollars of opportunity. And I think, the acquisition was certainly a game changer in terms of the direction the city was going to be headed in the future.
Many, many years ago, a powerful supernatural being prepared the earth for humans and created the Nisqually, Suquamish, Snoqualmie, and others to inhabit the land. These original peoples of the Puget Sound numbered in the tens of thousands and lived a life closely connected to the rivers and oceans along which they lived. The original residents of what is currently called Tacoma are now known as the Puyallup, and their primary villages were located at the mouth of the Puyallup River and spanned outward to dozens of other villages along the shores, creeks, and waterways. The first European to settle this region came in 1852, and upon seeing an abundance of natural resources and access to the Sound, built a water-powered sawmill to harvest the old-growth forests. Because of its access to a deep water harbor, the area was selected to be the terminus of the Northern Pacific Railroad, which opened its ports to the world, and the city of Tacoma was incorporated soon after, in 1875. What followed was a boom in population and construction that cemented the city as an industrial powerhouse of the Pacific Northwest. For the next 100 years, businesses along the Waterway and throughout the city thrived, unaware of the damage they were causing to the environment.
I remember one day my uncle said to me, "We didn't do anything wrong to this property. Oh, it's those sulfur springs up at Mount Rainier that have infected all of these lands around here." But that's coming from a position of saying, it's not my fault. I didn't do anything that I thought was wrong. This is the way businesses were machining. You needed oil and grease in your machines in order to make them work, in order to make the products to put into the landing gears of the planes that you were building for Boeing. They had the whole world in front of them. They were so excited. And those who were involved really had no sense of what the environmental impact was. My 2.5 acres is a very small part of this, but it's huge to me. The Vermont Marble Company had owned that piece of property. Then it was bought by my grandfather, Martin Petrich, because he needed another boatyard because they were building so many boats. They also then started a machine shop, very active and very successful, until it wasn't anymore. In 1993, after 52 years as an industrial site, Marine Iron Works closes and plans to go away without cleaning the property. And so now this becomes, well, we put it here, the site of the $1 million cleanup. The historical contaminants that may have been used included white lead, lead paint, copper wiring, heavy oils, grease, gasoline, battery acids, and PCBs. Well, what were we going to do now that we knew that there was contamination on the property?
Under Superfund Act, all past owners are perpetually liable. All future owners buy into that same liability. So if you get in the chain of title, you're liable.
Both under federal law and our state law, there isn't something like a statute of limitations. If somebody was responsible for contamination 100 years ago, they're still responsible for it even now. If you had an activity that was going on clear back, let's say in the 1800s, there is still a responsibility for somebody to clean that up.
The amount of money these cleanups cost creates a lot of litigation, and then that creates a lot of time and a lot of delay. Who's responsible for the cleanup? How much is this company versus that company? Is it this insurance company? Is it that polluter?
The conflict was that the owners of the property believed that those who had operated there for more than 50 years, especially running the machine shop, and were responsible for the contamination that was there, also had the responsibility for the cleanup. Now, What you may not know is that early insurance on properties did not have any exclusion clauses about contamination until the 70s. The activities that went on this dock that primarily had contaminated the dock had occurred when the property was insured. The truth was that you had to get to the insurers because they were the only ones who actually were going to be able to do the cleanup, and that took an incredibly long time. So the no further action letter was the goal for many, many years. Dear Claire Petrich, the Washington State Department of Ecology received your request for an opinion on your independent cleanup. This letter provides our opinion. Is further remedial action necessary to clean up contamination at the site? The answer is no. I feel like I've played a very personal part in an environmental cleanup on this property, and it's been a great learning experience. Let's put it that way.
Claire Petrich was not alone. Even though the city had purchased and taken responsibility for 27 acres of contaminated land along the waterway, there were still multiple other properties held by private owners that were either contaminated or contributing contamination to the waterway. These owners, identified as potentially responsible parties, had to negotiate responsibility with the city, state, and federal agencies, as well as insurance providers and previous property owners, which further complicated the cleanup process. While these negotiations were taking place, the revitalization of downtown continued. The key to success turned out to be the historic buildings that were once threatened during the age of urban renewal in the 1970s.
Urban renewal was a solution to urban problems, which involved taking down all the buildings, often leaving just empty holes. On the other hand, we did not urbanly renew ourselves to the point that we lost some magnificent buildings. The Pantages Theater, Union Station, the entire campus of the University of Washington in Tacoma is in former warehouses. So happily, this community had some wonderful places escaped the Wreckers Ball. In the mid-'80s, a handful of women, the women I refer to as 7 ladies with brooms, decided that they had had enough seeing the Seattle Symphony at a high school auditorium.
And these were matriarchs of the arts, and they wanted a new theater for downtown, and they wanted to renovate this building, which had become a movie house, not always showing the first-run movies. And they went in and they cleaned up the first couple of rows of the theater and cleaned it up enough so that they could then hold an event there on the stage and try to present to people what this could be.
And indeed, they created one of the first public-private partnerships between a city and a group of individuals to restore an old movie theater into a performing arts center.
And again, it was controversial because people in the community felt that spending money on the arts was not the core responsibility of government. And it was so ironic with a dilapidated downtown that struggled for decades, that was vacant, where stores were closed, where crime was on the streets. Throughout all of that, the glimmer of hope came through the cultural arts.
The Pantages Theater project was the first. It was kind of the kickoff to the revitalization effort. We didn't really know that this was a revitalization effort, but we were doing kind of one project at a time.
So renovating Pantages Theater began that whole birth.
And it also empowered community members saying, my goodness, look what we did there. You know, I hear that the old abandoned Union Station is set for demolition. It had been abandoned for decades, and it was going to be destroyed.
When it got to the point where the greater community was confronted with the loss of Union Station and that physical architectural era that was there, there was a reaction against it. I think it was the idea that Rather than keep trying to tear the city down and rebuild it in a better model, let's recognize that it's something that was built well in the first place and it's fixable.
And Union Station, in my view, would be the thing that really every Tacoman had a connection to. Everyone, the stories, the letters, the things that people would share with us about sending their kids off to war, sending their kids to college. It was America's transportation system.
But it was pretty run down by the 70s and was really nothing that Burlington Northern, now Burlington Northern Santa Fe, wanted responsibility for. So they basically said, y'all want it? Because if not, we probably need to tear it down. We don't want it anymore.
Because the maintenance was terrible, and the roof was leaking, and everything you can imagine was wrong with the building. After years of pretty minimal maintenance, the building was a shambles. And so we bought the Union Station for $1, and then we spent something like $1 million on either side of those empty lots.
And there were a lot of kind of wacky ideas for what you could do with Union Station. There was talk about an ice skating rink in the middle and some sort of arcade around it. There was some talk of a shopping mall.
It's economic reuse. You just can't have a bunch of empty historic buildings. There has to be a revenue stream to support restoring a building.
There was a gentleman who wrote a letter to the editor named Seymour Johnson. And he said, I noticed that the federal courts need additional office space in Tacoma. Why doesn't Norm Dix get busy back there and see if Union Station could be converted into a federal courthouse?
What it really resolved around is how we could, in essence, get the federal court system to restore Union Station and renovate it as a federal courthouse. And that effort required legislation in the United States Congress.
So we got busy and we found that, in fact, it could be done. And so we put a provision in the appropriations bill.
And Ed Thomas and I drafted an amendment that said they shall develop this federal courthouse at Union Station.
Not you may or could. And they later told us if you hadn't put shall in there, we wouldn't have done it. But they were proud of the project.
The one that is probably the most smashing success is the University of Washington, Tacoma.
There was an effort on the part of the legislators to expand access to education. And so they started a bill that talked about branch campuses.
The president of the University of Washington hesitated on this, so we had to, a number of us talked to him. Bill Gerberding, great guy, but not as strong on branch campuses as I would have liked. And so it took the local effort to just plead with him to allow this thing to happen in Tacoma.
Members of the Executive Council put together a fund of $1 million to buy property in the current campus location in order to encourage the University of Washington to locate there, and then donated that property to the University of Washington as an incentive. That helped really drive the location in downtown. It helped drive the opportunity for the University of Washington to restore a lot of old buildings throughout the downtown campus area.
UWT first opened, it was basically a kind of a commuter college. So there wasn't any housing, there wasn't anything. And so it wouldn't change really the whole downtown core that much. Now that it's really become a 4-year program, we have younger students, we have housing needs now. So it's really changing it where people are, it's become more of a vibrant community with the students living in downtown Tacoma.
So we were looking for, at that time, we were looking for a lot of real-life solutions. The former approach was that we're going to force people to go downtown, like we're going to have more office workers, and other things will follow. And our philosophy more was like, why don't we get it so people want to come downtown? You know, we can't compete head-on with the mall. You know, what else could we do that the mall doesn't have to have people come down here?
In the 1990s, Tacoma experienced a renaissance that brought new life into the downtown core. Old, neglected buildings were rehabilitated, adapted, and reused, attracting people to the once empty streets. Meanwhile, the Thea Foss Waterway was in the middle of a long journey in which each small step was a great leap forward, bringing them closer and closer to their goal.
So the Environmental Master Plan was a document that the city worked with consultants, both technical and legal, to put together to look at this project holistically. Environmental issues both on the upland properties that we had just purchased, in the waterway. The best way to address everything was to do it in a very strategic and logical way.
The first thing that we did as part of the master plan was we developed a pretty precedent-setting agreement with the Department of Ecology for what had to happen for revitalization, for redevelopment of the upland properties that surround the Foss to be able to attract developers and new owners. The consent decree not only defines what the requirements are, but it also provides protections. So the consent decree protects the city from having to do more than what is defined in the consent decree. It says, this is what you have to do, and if you do this, you're good, and nobody else can sue you and make you do something different. So it's a final agreement that really defines the rules for what's necessary. At the very same time, also in '94, the city reached out to the EPA and said, hey, we'd like to be in charge of the Superfund cleanup process on the Foss, which is also extremely unique because usually EPA and their lawyers have to track down and force responsible parties to do cleanup because it's very costly, and it's strange to have somebody be proactive and say, hey, I'd like to take on this liability and clean it up, and that's what the city did.
And what we needed to talk about was not doing less, but making certain we did it in a timely way, and we did it in a way that provided the maximum public benefit, but without the bureaucracy and the regulatory hurdles that were largely designed in the law around people who were not cooperative, who didn't want to do it.
Between '94 and 2003, the city did everything necessary to prepare for implementation of the remedy, and they evaluated multiple alternatives for how to clean it up. The design of the remedy has to do with where do you dredge, where do you cap, how much do you dredge, what do you do with the marinas, what do you do with all the existing piling and structures that are in the waterway, what do you do on the banks of the waterway. So then finally a decision was made in about the 2001 timeframe about the preferred alternative. So all of that design and permitting happened, and then in 2003, finally it was time that the remedy could start to be implemented. And the remedy was implemented between 2003 and 2006. So in that time frame, all the dredging happened, all the capping, all the treatment of the shorelines, and so forth occurred.
So it only took 3 years to actually do the cleanup. It took 20 years to get through the process to get the cleanup done.
In total, 185 potentially responsible parties were identified as having contributed contaminants to the waterway and uplands, while 88 legal agreements were negotiated. During the course of the cleanup, approximately 425,000 cubic yards of material was dredged from the Thea Foss and Wheeler-Osgood waterways, much of which was used to fill an adjacent industrial waterway to create new land for development. The remedial action chosen for the sediments in the waterway took into account future maritime needs of the waterway while being as cost-effective as possible. As allowed by the EPA, it included a combination of dredging, capping with clean, sandy material, and natural recovery where historic sources of contamination had been eliminated. More than 12 acres of habitat restoration were created to mitigate impacts of construction and bring plants and wildlife back to the area. 20 years of patience, planning, and collaboration was finally paying off. But to truly revitalize the waterway, it needed new development on the newly cleaned up properties on the adjacent uplands. Planning ahead, the city created an agency for just this task.
The cleanup had to come first, obviously, to attract that private development. And then the city of Tacoma, through Julie Wilkerson and Ray Corpus, began the process of marketing the properties over a period of time. And they established the Thea Foss Waterway Development Authority that helped govern all of that redevelopment.
The city put together the plan with the community for the vision of the waterway, and then recognized in their charter that the city cannot sell waterfront property. So the Development Authority was created for that purpose, to be the implementation arm to the community plan and be able to sell waterfront property.
Well, I think the importance of the Development Authority was, number one, to get the decision-making out of politics, to get it away from the council. Secondly, was to be able to bring individuals with good knowledge to the table.
Housing in the city of Tacoma was such that there was no market rate housing. And the city needed to demonstrate that market rate housing could work in Tacoma, and needed to have market rate housing so you had residents with disposable income that could attract retail, small retail, restaurants, and other activities that would help reactivate the core of Tacoma.
You cannot be successful if we had put from one end to the other nothing but housing. It makes it private, which means the public can't come down and make use of that. So we wanted marinas, we wanted restaurants, we wanted housing, we wanted public institutions like the Museum of Glass to all coexist and to develop over time. That was the purpose behind that master plan as the Foss Waterway developed it.
In the early days of trying to get projects going on the waterfront, we looked at all kinds of different museums, an aquarium, a hydroplane museum, a carousel museum, and then we came up with the idea of a museum of glass on the waterfront. We went to the city and we asked them if we could option what was called the Morris site, just north of the Albers Mill building. We started construction, I think, in about 1995. The museum opened its doors in 2003.
The Museum of Glass was the first investment, but it was not a test of public acceptance. The first housing project was our first chance to say, all right, the investors are willing to be at the table, but will the public follow them?
The Museum of Glass was going forward, so what was next door was a very important component of making a decision and our ability to tell the community about what we're going to do.
In the early days, it was difficult to sell Tacoma to the development community. And I think part of the reason that was the case is because Tacoma had a great vision, but developers need to look at dollars and cents, and can I get a return on my investment? Am I going to be able to get this project financed? If I get it financed, am I going to be able to lease it up?
The economics of it is very difficult as well. All the more reason to tip your hat to the folks who have been able to pull off projects, because it's hard.
A lot of banks were a little bit hesitant. Remember, we're in a Superfund site, and years ago, I remember at the Port of Tacoma taking phone calls from lawyers, and they basically said, our board of directors will not let us spend $1 in a Superfund designated site.
The Foss Waterway Development Authority, in order to develop properties, is required to do it through a competitive solicitation process. And so we issue what is called a request for proposal or interest. Team Tacoma came in and won the proposal and subsequently built Thea's Landing, but not without a lot of challenges. Probably the biggest being a week before we were ready to close and sign on all the documents so they could commence with construction, one of their lenders backed out and the project suddenly was not fully funded.
It took us a little bit of convincing of our financing partner, Columbia Bank, that we could make this a viable project. So this would be the largest residential project in Tacoma, which at that time in downtown Tacoma was not the place to be. As we know, banks need numbers, and there weren't a lot of historical numbers to basically show what could be done in downtown Tacoma. So we were, as many people called us, the pioneers, not only us, but the banks and all our partners. When Team Tacoma was put together, we sat down with our entire group and discussed what it is we wanted to accomplish, and we came up with a mission statement. And our mission statement was to create a world-class destination celebrating community, understanding the maritime history, and forging a legacy of Thea Foss.
You know, the story about the Foss Waterway, when you really talk about it, is you want that win-win. You want to win on cleaning up the environmental contamination, whether it's the upland or the in-water, but also come back with your redevelopment story. And we were able to do that both in the upland as well as the in-water.
Cities are like people. They grow and learn, but sometimes stumble and fall. In the 1980s, Tacoma fell hard, but never gave up. Instead, they dusted themselves off and took control of their destiny. Since completion of the cleanup in 2006, the Thea Foss Waterway has continued to develop with the addition of 3 housing developments and 2 museums. 4.5 acres of additional parks are planned to accompany the existing 4 acres of parkland, plus the public esplanade that runs along the waterfront. The revitalization effort that started in and along this polluted waterway has since spurred further development in the downtown core, with over 2,196 units of new housing, the restoration of Elks Temple, and the new Convention Center Hotel. As for the waterway itself, the city continues to monitor the sediments and contributions from stormwater to ensure the Foss stays clean and is working with the EPA to have the site delisted as a Superfund site on the national priorities list.
So the City of Tacoma is working very closely with the EPA to continue to make sure that we keep the Thea Foss Waterway clean and safe, making sure that we're addressing stormwater issues and other issues in the water to make sure that it stays clean. We did not do all this work and come this far to go backwards.
So the Centers for Urban Waters was one of Karen Larkin's really forward-thinking ideas. Somewhere along the line, she got the idea that we have this talent group. You know, we should create a center around this talent that we've developed for the cleanup of Tacoma so that we can, you know, continue to study it and then share those lessons learned with other organizations, with other municipalities, with other states even, other people around the world.
So the Center for Urban Waters is built right here on the Thea Foss Waterway. The facility includes folks from the City of Tacoma Environmental Services Department. In addition, in the building are folks from the University of Washington, Tacoma.
And with all those people in the same area, in the same building, in the same structure, we get these synergies across the board on how to help other people not make some of the mistakes Tacoma made in the early years. So it's a natural meeting place for a lot of scientists, a lot of activists, a lot of nonprofit water quality groups come here, but also internationally it's starting to get some acclaim, and people are coming to learn what we're doing and how we're doing it so that they can take those lessons back home.
Tacoma is a recognized leader in the field of stormwater management, and so the work that we're doing here is state of the art, and a lot of that is tied to the fact that the Superfund projects led us down this path.
The whole story behind the cleanup and redevelopment of Thea Foss it's pretty profound. To see the differences it's mind-boggling, frankly, because like I say, when we first started down there, it was a danger. It wasn't just contaminated, it was dangerous. And to see, you know, people down there now, you have all these activities that are going on, you have people living down there. It's like night and day.
I look today at what we've accomplished versus where we sat back in the 80s, and looking at the theater district and the Union Station and the Thea Foss and the housing along there, I look at all of that this community has pulled together and made come about, and it has improved their lot in life.
Tacoma needed it, and I'm so proud of what we accomplished. It was a miracle. It really was a miracle. But it was a restoration miracle, and Tacoma is so much better. It was fun to do. I mean, the spur was phenomenal. The Pantages was phenomenal. Union Station, phenomenal.
In the end, the vision was to see something better than what it was. Tacoma's rebirth is embracing the culture of responsibility to clean up the polluted legacy of the past. And it allowed us, in my judgment, to get on with our future.
The city's role in the Superfund cleanup and in the revitalization of Tacoma and how they integrated those things was really game-changing, and I think sets an incredible precedent really for the rest of the country and a lot of other places.
I guess I'm hoping that the story of the Thea Foss Waterway isn't just the executive council and the congressmen and the city managers and people like that, that it's also people in town who also cared about it, who had a slightly different vision for what it could look like, and were persistent and made the project better.
There's so many names of people who have put their all into this project, and it's really pretty great to see what can happen when a whole lot of people work hard on something for 30 years.
I can remember in the past, there were oil slicks on the Thea Foss Waterway. Nobody would have called anybody about them because they were always there. There was always a sheen on the water. And today, people see that sheen, see that spill, and they do something about it. So local citizens are taking action that 30 years ago, they never would have taken.
I think the moral of this story is that protecting Puget Sound is everyone's responsibility. Tacoma's done a lot and gone a long way in cleaning up the legacy contamination and cleaning up the sources, but as far as ongoing in Puget Sound, it's really everyone's responsibility to have a role and take care of it.